Bien, alors si vous voulez vous asseoir, on va pouvoir commencer cette...
So we're going to begin this roundtable meeting this morning, and this is how we'll end this morning. So roundtable on the monographies of the architectural schools in France. So during the Congress in 2016, there had been a workshop on these monographies. At the time, there were two monographies, one on Strasbourg that had been carried out by Anne-Marie Châtelet and Frank Storm, the speaker corrects himself, and one at the École de Nantes that had been managed by a drafting group, and I was part of them with Philippe Bataille, the headmaster of the school, and Philippe was a coordinator. So the program launched by Anne-Marie after the publication, it was a monography, and all the schools had been solicited at the time. A certain number answered. Some projects reached completion, like the Toulouse project that came out in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. The Bordeaux project, well, for Toulouse, we have Constance Ringon and Enrico Chapelle. Constance Ringon, who's a lecturer in Toulouse, and Enrico Chapelle, who's professor in Strasbourg. But I'm mixing up everything, sorry, says the speaker. I'm still in Toulouse, sorry, says the speaker. And who was in Strasbourg? You, sorry. So I'm correcting myself. Gauthier Boll, who was in Bordeaux, but who is now in Strasbourg, who is one of the directors of the book on Bordeaux that will be published very soon. Stéphanie Dadour with Sybille Levaux, who manages the book on Grenoble, which is being drafted, and André Sauvage, who is one of the two authors with Daniel Lequidic for the book from Rennes. So other books are being prepared, but they are not as advanced as the ones for which we've invited the authors today. So with you, I'd like to raise a certain number of questions. Each one of you could have expressed yourselves on each of the themes, but we have a limited amount of time, so I will ask some specific questions to each one of you according to some points that were more developed in this or that book. We regret the absence of Fabrice Lafouquet, who was supposed to talk about the book on Marseille, prepared by a team from the INAMA laboratory in Marseille. She could not come, unfortunately, and none of her two colleagues who are also managing the book, Annabella Di Aruccio and Remy, could come either. So that monography is missing, and we were supposed to talk about that also today. So I would like to talk to each of the four representatives of the monographies to deal about the economy of the book, the chronology retained, because as Daniel was saying earlier on, some began working on the 17th century, 18th century, and others, like Marseille, stuck to 1905, 2005, which was the chronology in Savin, because each school wants us to work on a particular time period. And this was broached by the different books. I mean, the whole history of teaching in Toulouse, Grenoble, or the history of that particular school, l'École nationale supérieure de l'architecture, and the previous one, the regional schools. So let's begin with the book that's already been published, which is the one from Toulouse. So Enrico, I want to give you the floor. Thank you. Well, as you specified, I'd like to say that this book was published in 2019, 2 years ago, nearly 2 or 3 years ago, to meet a request from the headmaster from our school who wanted to publish this book for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the creation of the pedagogical unit of architecture in Toulouse. And the other context, which is also quite important, before the launching of the competition to renew the school, to the premises of the school, and the worksite began in 2020. So the teams had trained on a volunteering basis after the request for this research. So we made this decision very rapidly, and we decided to have a kind of summary book very quickly with the first results from our research and texts that had already been published, that already existed on the history of teaching in Toulouse. And they had been published on various media, and we were supposed to collect them and compile them in one single book. For example, the contribution of Marjorie Guélan on the Royal Academy of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture of Toulouse, which was created in 1750. That's in the 18th century. So we didn't do any research on the 18th and 19th centuries, but there were already quite a number of things. And one of the contributors of that book, Jean Riffa, whom you know because he participated, he's very active in several of the meetings you organized, and he had an approach on research over a long time period, and he gave a lot of importance to continuity between the École des Beaux-Arts and the École des Industrielle in Toulouse, and the École d'Architecture that exists until today. So this explains the subtitle, Prémices de l'Histoire. For us, it is not a book that tells us about work accomplished, but it collects some information, some data that can be used in the framework of some other research. As for the chronology, it begins in the 18th century, and in the first part, which is where he starts presenting the organization, there are three parts. A first part with the contributions from researchers who've studied teaching, the history of teaching in Toulouse, by basing themselves on sources and archives, some 100 pages. And then there's a second part with the testimonies of teachers who were involved in research and in the creation of the research units in Toulouse. And here they talk about the period between 1980 until 2010. And then there's a third part which talks about the archive campaign that we did in our research, where we consulted all the archives. And Constance will talk about this later on. Did I answer your question? Yes, there are a lot of testimonies on research. Now, in terms of methodology, is it the players themselves who express themselves, or the other solution would have been to ask historians to draft based on interviews with the players? Have you chosen to give the floor directly to the players? Well, the interview campaign had been desired. We wanted to do it, but actually we distributed a page with questions, and then each player, based on that page, did what he wanted to do and said whatever he wanted to say. And that part is made up partly from the testimonies that had been presented during the roundtable that had been organized in June 2017, during the first seminar, that we completed with other testimonies afterwards by directly asking the people. Thank you. Gauthier, I'll ask you the same question, therefore. So there are similar things with what Enrico said about Toulouse. So our book on the history of teaching in Bordeaux will be published in a month at the end of November at the Presse Universitaire de Bordeaux in a collection managed by Claire Parrin, Architecture et Paysage. The project is the fruit of the M. Savant project, because after this joint seminar in Toulouse and Bordeaux, the whole point about the round tables, which was underlined by Daniel Lequedic in Bordeaux, this gave birth to a momentum. This wasn't new. Girago had already set a certain number of things. There were already some sources, and gradually the forces got together, and the book we're proposing is pursuing the contributions that we had in the En Savant. So there's the first part of the book with contributions from researchers and historians, and here they talk about history over the long period of time from the 17th century until our days today. And so half of the people who were there were already there at the seminar in Bordeaux, and then there are some new people too, and they talked about this topic. And just as in Toulouse, there are 4 parts, but there's another major part with testimonies from players. That wasn't our idea, but it's because of the health crisis that we collected their written testimonies and we offered a framework, and we have varied, very free testimonies from them. And in an intermediary section, we have the second part of the testimonies, which are theoretical positions of teachers. In the testimonies, there are some people who are talking about their memoirs as students or even as teachers, but the atmosphere of the school as they knew it. And there were some texts that were more theoretical between the historical contributions in the first part and the testimonies in the third. And we had a third part with material for research, which is well made, but we can pursue this work with catalogs from teachers and students. Thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Stephanie Dadour. It's a book which is a book on historians rather than testimonies from players. Well, I would say it's both. We had the same ambition as in Toulouse to publish this book for 2019 for the 40th anniversary of the schools, but it didn't work out that way. And so there were very few people at the school who knew the school well or who had done work on the history of teaching or the history of the teaching in the institutions. And with Sybille Levotte, we carried out archival work so that together we could collect the necessary material based on these archives so as to write a very linear story about the teaching of architecture in Grenoble. So this book begins in 1898. That's the time when we restructured the teaching of architecture in Grenoble. And here we wanted to bring together all the artistic training for art workers, and that is the École des Arts Industriels. It was created in 1898 by Henri Dime. So we started at that date, and we went until 2005. The book is made up of 3 parts, a very historical part. With Sybille, we present this significant amount of work, long work, and then the rest of the book is made up of articles that we ordered from people, teachers, former teachers, but also people who took part in the activities of the school, but who have a critical hindsight because they did something else afterwards. And a second part with research and teaching, and that is the identity of the Grenoblois school. And at the end of the 68, early 70s, they brought together research and teaching, and a third part on the production that were enhanced in that school. So those are the three parts. There was a major campaign with Sibyl. We carried out a lot of interviews, former students who became teachers. So that is before 68 and post 68. We were interested about that time period, and the archiving work, reading all the archives that took us 3 years non-stop. Thank you.
Benoit from the School of Architecture of Brittany. Given that it's no longer the School of Architecture of Rennes, is Brittany, or West Brittany. Yes, I joined that story through an outside intervention from Daniel, yes, who kindly asked me to participate to part of the encyclopedia, the very end of it, to bring some elements of information on the most recent experience. In between the two, there was a discrimination in the organization as to the way the work was organized, I mean. So that Daniel has been working for a long time on the gradual emergence of teaching architecture in France, is working specifically on the pre-1968 period. And I, for one, work for the post-68 period. Paradoxically, these are two authors that are currently drafting their work, their book, but they're no longer part of the School of Architecture. Daniel and myself, we both left. This being said, and starting from this, how do we get organized? We got organized from the methodological point of view, following the DNA of our various disciplines. Now, the organization was cut in two, the split into two, broken down into two. Two parts, two periods, and the way we work are slightly different. Daniel works a lot, and it's still the case, on the sources of archives, mostly, but also looking into a set of documentary resources that are very interesting, very clarifying remote periods. You mentioned this morning going back to the 18th century. Now, this is a period of time which gradually covers a number of societies, architects, organizations, central organizations that, in fact, came in to take back that idea that architecture became a necessity for societies during the 19th century, for the societies to get organized. So this is a step based again on archives and documents. So all this led us to understand how at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, in Rennes and in the Brittany region, this problem of creating a school became obvious. On my side, I, for one, participated, and I worked more on this idea of collecting a whole set of documents, challenging the previous speakers, interviewing them, the previous players. This was the basis of my work, about carrying out 60 interviews, other previous educators, directors, students, archivists in the school, because they have a good view and an opinion on what happened in that recent period, but also gathering drawings, design, videos, pictures, very conventionally. And there are souvenirs also. For 40 years being in that school, I have souvenirs. So it's my own archives that I have to go through again. And in a way, taking a critical eye on the way we are going to use this archive. And I do it discussing with other people who've gone through the same events so that I can take a step backward. So much for the methodology that we have used. As to the way we are exhibiting the work, the way we are presenting it, we are currently following a strategy which is slightly different. On the one hand, for the pre-reform period, we present a narrative by the players, architects, political players, those in charge of the firms, societies of architects. So you have players who come and take the floor, Martello, Jaurès, Lefort in Rennes. For the second type of presentations or exhibition, I've presented the mosaics of different themes where we are looking more from a bottom-up approach, from the writing, the way students are trained in the centers, the demographic weight increases, migration increases, so that the students they really are the founders of their own school of architecture, and this is something that we note in what we see in that school the history of that school. Fine. Many of you mentioned sources, the materials, and it so happens that in Toulouse, your book is 45 pages of publications, different sources. Constance, would you mind presenting all this? Constance. Yes, thank you. It is true. The work on education, as we carried out in Toulouse, has given us the possibility to build a panorama of existing sources to tell a narrative, tell a story. Through the publication of that work, we wanted to deliver a tool to other research workers, presenting to them a panorama so that they will know where the sources are. And I would like to revert to this, it's like a dashboard that we built up. For the fine arts period, the very beginnings of the original school, we focused on archives that are still in the Beaux-Arts de Toulouse. The school has a new name, ISDAT. This is a historical type of school, and where architecture was taught before the 70s. So they still have a wide panel of documentation, dossiers from students and teachers, educators, plus a number of drawings, design. Some of the archives are also sent by them to the municipal archives, and this is the case of catalogs of works from the libraries of the École des Beaux-Arts. This was one of the first sources of our research work. Then, as to the regional school, in the second part, and the pedagogical unit, we look at the departmental archives. The department archives, where we had to go through all the funds, and we realized at that time that many of the documents had been placed at the department archives by the school unit, by the School of Architecture's various units. So we gathered a number of documents which represent one of the two graph booklets that we prepared on the plan and project by Georges Condelis and Malbranche, on the pedagogical approach. We also have a number of documents on later periods until the 90s. Another non-neglected source, which is the School of Architecture, listing the PFEs, the plans that are still available at the library. And this is something quite significant to understand the way the teaching was organized by the study directors, the name of these directors, one after the other, or working together. And following this approach, we looked into the individuals who had really worked to organize archives that were not considered as archive originally. Christian Prost was one. He was the photographer of the School of Architecture. And we had to look into our funds of archives with an input, visual input to the history of that school, telling the work site in that school, this is the second calligraphy, and telling us another narrative of other events, which will be getting together, political events, parties that really throw another eye on the history of the school. Last item, the oral sources. These sources were used as a one-shot element. The place of research work was mentioned. Jean mentioned it before. Also, the presence of women in that history. And we'll revert to this later, so that we have a general picture of all these sources that led to the narrative of that history. There are some limitations which come from a number of funds deposited at the Musée Paul Dupuy, the drawings and designs of students for the original School of Toulouse, and this design and drawings have not been processed. We did not have access to it, given that the curator does not wish to do anything on it, nor any processing to put them in a fund. Fine. Few words on the School of Marseille, where the option was to publish the curriculum of 1984-1985. I have no explanation. I'm not of that age. I'm sure it corresponds to something. It means something to them, but I do not know. A few words on how the Marseille book or work was organized. They had a lot of sources for the original School of Architecture, yet very few archives on education and the School of Architecture. The second part is essentially dedicated to archives from the previous students, from the previous educators and teachers, and private archives. And they did really build to that story again. Jeanne Dumont was telling us earlier that in 1968 event had not delivered any articles or interviews. Well, it is processed and approaching many of our work. Yet, you might have thought that there would have been some sort of a continuity. And Guittier-Boll, in one chapter of his book, refers to the history of the Bordeaux School from 1928 to 1978, hence covering May 1968. Could you explain your option here? Indeed. Gauthier. Indeed, this is a collective piece of work. So the option is my option from my own approach, but we have multiple different approaches depending on the author concerned. Now, what did strike me, on a personal note, when I looked into the archives of the School of Architecture, was that continuum that we had. Even if we had a lot of players who talked about the founding event behind May 1968, and we found that a couple of years after May 1968, something was put back into order, and maybe the building, the construction of the premises themselves. But as we saw, the affirmation of a rather conservative type of teaching for the Bordeaux School of Architecture. In my own contribution, I work on prosopography from the students, and I work more on the history of original school. And in 1968, when the original School of Architecture was closed, you have a number of students who started a new curriculum within the regional school, and they went to the pedagogical unit. So I thought this prosopography did not have to be discontinued in May '68, but to see what the future lied ahead of them, who left, who stayed, with this new conservative, well, there's a caricature, but a new reform, I mean, impulsed by the schools of architecture from Paris, but that gave rise to a new movement. Fine. The School of Architecture of Brittany, Daniel Lecoué-Dick, in his work about what happened until 1968, and for the project I read, addresses specific moments, such as the setting up of regional schools, First World War, yes, the Vichy regime, yes, and the lack of authors, I would say, in '68. And André Sauvage took over. But he seemed to start slightly before May '68, don't you? Back in the '60s, with that sort of upheaval before. And from the project I read, as far as your part is concerned, you seem to draw a lot of attention to the governance of the school. And apparently it is this moment of, what shall I call them, general assemblies in the school, which create the event. And the various school managers that are very important in sequencing the school's creation. Indeed, when we had the UP closing in Rennes, there was a total upheaval because there was a radical discrimination between the previous type of education and the new education in 1968. 1968, almost of all the teachers left the school, all but one, and we have a new management and new teachers coming in, people who had never been educators, and they had to face students, as Remy said, who were there before, who knew what the school was, they knew what education was, and they didn't want that type of education. Yet, very rapidly, they had to face these new teachers who came from abroad, foreign countries, from Quebec, for most of them, bringing in an American type of culture, because between Quebec and the United States, you had a porosity of cultures. I'd like to remind you that in 1965, a major survey was carried out on challenging education. This was from the MIT, an inspiration for Quebec. Anyway, they joined with Henri de Vaudreuil. They came to her, and after 1 year, a crash. Part of the students, if not all of them, were in favor of this type of education, but, well, they had good relationship, I believe, with the teachers, the couple of teachers that had joined, but no visibility. So, opposition, and Beauclerc is going to play a major role to try and alleviate or calm down the stress and tension. And being above and beyond that conflict is something that was done realizing that you had to open a discussion, a debate. And this morning, I believe I understood that students often listen, but at that time what they required or demanded was to express themselves. May '68, yes, everyone wanted to express him or herself. Well, this was more or less accepted in our school. So anyway, we went beyond that first problem. And someone mentioned La Boulée. And whether free expression, ideas coming from the Greeks, I don't know. And a decision was taken for a new orientation. I'd like to remind you that this was the time when the idea of having full autonomy of the school was emerging. Autonomy of the school, autonomy of the students, autonomy of self-assessment, self-evaluation, and projects presented by the students. So they had to find teachers. So this is exactly where we stood. In October 1971 marked the end of this discussion with the publication of a charter, which was a written text on objectives and projects expressed through what would become a new architect, and with new teachers or a new framework of teachers. So this is what we saw. And then there are a couple of two or three other difficult events. The second type of problems was around the premises themselves, the buildings, because I say we because I was part of them at that time, premises that we just could not live in, not acceptable. And the school decided that we could have a project on a new school. I believe the second type of difficulty came up because the school director at that time was forced to become a contractor, but he had no skills for this. He had no means and resources for this. So this was extremely difficult, a very complex period, and you had a number of people saying, well, this is architecture of no power, we feel impotent. And this was rather costly to all of them because we came with 4 different projects. And the director at that time, who was also to be the type of builder, could not react. He couldn't do everything. Thanks God, the Ministry of Culture gave the necessary tools and resources so that this type of thing would never happen again. And the last difficulty around the directors themselves. Again, there's a very complex moment, given that at a given moment we saw an opposition from the directors. Suzanne was one of them. He had very good reasons. But he brought in some sort of an opposition from the students to the orientations taken by the school. And back in the 80s, at that time, no solution could be found to reconcile the directors and the board of directors. So, very complex decisions were taken, votes, and at the end of the day, the chairman of the board of directors was convened by the national director of that time. He was asked to come, but should not have taken place because of directors' votes, and passes on to central management the decisions taken to refuse such or such director. But the director himself at that time asked the president of the board of directors to criticize him while supporting the appointment of another director. Well, I'll have many, many other things to say for that school. So the problem of management and governance remained. Thank you. Okay, back to what we said to the state of research. When you published your work back in 2019, gave great importance to the creation of a curriculum, books, etc. Yes, that's the contribution that you can see from that piece of work. We targeted 2 essential periods. One, going from Vasid to the École Industrielle and School of Fine Arts. That took place very late, 1940, 1942. And in fact, this period of time has been studied by Henri Fabre, looking to the difference of educational approach among these two institutions. And then Laurent Gérard looked into the creation through the first director, Jean-Louis Gillet. But you see a lot of continuum among the 30s, 40s, and 50s, because the teachers at that time, who went to teach at the regional school of Toulouse, had been recruited back in the 30s, when you still had the fine arts, School of Fine Arts. So, until 1942. I say continuum, also maintained by the links of the École de Toulouse with the Le Maresquier workshops, things that had been set up for the first half of the 20th century until the creation of the regional school. And then the second major moment was May 1968. Well, it's not 1968 as such. No. School of Toulouse was more similar to the case of Brittany than the case of Bordeaux. Yes, we already had noted changes among the corps of teachers. But I would say that early in the 60s, with the coming of Candelis in Mirail and other architects, quite an impact. And the students already in 65 organized a new workshop supported by Group C, Candelis, in Grand Palais. And this is a specific item for the School of Toulouse, as when before we reported to Group A. So you see two separate workshops that coexisted for about 3 years. They got together, they merged, and during that merging, all the teachers, Workshop A, Workshop C, well, just had to leave. And some of the teachers, new teachers were hired, previous students, all from foreign countries, such as Rush, who built the school with Candelis, and Le Gray, who comes from the Soviet Union. He had studied in Moscow at the Institute of Architecture and Urban Development of Moscow. So, it can be said the educational aspect presented in Toulouse is characteristics of what is a laboratory, a lab. Someone said this morning you had a new curriculum, new program. Yes, that's exactly what is striking in Toulouse. In the 70s and the first years of life of this unité pédagogique. And then came a third step, which we do not see in our work, and that's early in the 80s. The beginning of the 80s is when we come back to a critical approach to what had been done during the first 2 years of EBAT, in a new environment and the way we look at cities, the cities and their history. And there is something quite significant here. It is from the 1980s onwards that in Toulouse we start talking about moving the school out of the Mirail quarter, from the center of the city out to the Mirail suburb. And it's still a topic in progress in Toulouse. It's still a topic we keep discussing about Montmirail, to enlarge, in fact, the building. I find this is the way for the teachers, the need to have new teachers back in the 70s, to come back now, downtown to the center is iconic of another critical approach, what has happened back in the 70s in that unit.
So the question about the place of the school, the situation of the school is very important. In Grenoble, in your book, you pay a lot of importance to the premises, the teaching. Yes, we talk about it in the introduction at one moment, and in a second episode, which is the extension of Simonet's school. The text was ordered from Franck Delorme because he's a historian, and he's been through this history of the extension of the school. So he's given us his point of view. But beyond the architecture of the school, the main idea is the link between the premises and multidisciplinarity, because the story about moving the school, the design, building a new school for Grenoble, that was an opportunity very early in the 70s to design all kinds of multidisciplinary teachings where it was a question of imagining the school. So the students were invited together with the teachers to imagine the school. So there were a lot of classes on teaching human sciences, social sciences, taking into account the whole area, and working on the prefabrication. So the sociology of the project, there were classes on this project, and that was at the beginning of the 70s, so as to imagine what an architectural school would look like during those years, that is after May 1968, and what should pedagogical class be. So here there were a lot of teachers who hadn't done anything in common, and then afterwards there was a lot of friction also between the teachers. It was a chapter that was very important in this period after 68 and before the school was built. And the second trend that we've noticed, and we're discussing this for the writing of a text for the Brest seminar on the multidisciplinarity, and the idea is that once the school moves, the new premises designed by Simonet, once they were accessible to the teachers and students, there is an affirmation in the pedagogical program of a renewal after 1968, but in 78, 79, it also asserts in its program a renewal which goes to this idea of multidisciplinarity. And this is done very gradually. At the beginning of the curriculum, we have teachings which are monodisciplinary, and then you have studios from the second year onwards, third year onwards, which are multidisciplinary. And we imagine in the third cycle, right from 1978 onwards, laboratories, which are not the research laboratories that we know of, but these are laboratories with all these work themes that we see in the agronomical laboratories. So in 1978, because of the moving into the new school, this marks this assertion in the program, in the curriculum, and this program is very different from the previous programs. There's no real break, though. It isn't something that's totally different, but there is this will to assert this multidisciplinarity and make it theoretical through this discourse on progressiveness, and to have this progressiveness, to have this multidisciplinarity. So this link between the new school, rather than talking about it in architectural forms, because the Grenoble school, this was an opportunity to talk about multidisciplinarity. Thank you. You've already talked about my next question, which is multidisciplinarity. I'd like to go back to Gauthier Bol and the premises in the creation of the UP buildings in Toulouse. These buildings that could proliferate, whereas in Bordeaux, the school is very formal because of the architect who is very much present in teaching. Well, the architect, with the help of students in the school, is Claude Ferrei. He was director of studies in 78 before 78 in the regional school, and he stayed until the mid-70s, and he will organize a competition between his students and a certain number of projects, counter projects, those that are not retained, which promotes the type of project described, modular, which allows a form of multidisciplinarity, as Stephanie said, and it's the head of the workshops, Mr. Ferrei, who won this competition. There was a strong contribution from Gilles Rago. And the composition, because here it is a composition of Ferrei, this asserts a very different position, a different posture. There are premises for the new disciplines that are then introduced in teaching, like environmental studies, social sciences, and they are away from the architectural forms. That's very clear. There's a distance between theoretical knowledge and the teaching of architecture and the project. And this composition was highly criticized at the ministry. There are project rapporteurs who said, well, this composition has a very particular form. It's curved. It will fix the building, the occupation of the site for dozens of years, and the extension since in the 90s and the years 2000 for laboratories. That was done around this composition that was extended over the site with Brazilian influences, which were very dear to Claude Ferrei. Yeah, and since then, you've developed research in the school, and now you can talk about the more recent times, the relationship between research and pedagogy and how you treat that in the book. Well, this book is treated in various parts of the book. You have the theoretical postures from the teachers like Isabelle Horikoff, because in spite of this academic reassertion, the school will open up, research is going to develop, and one of the significant facts in Bordeaux is the creation in the 90s of a landscaping school. So there's a very clear text, the position of Isabelle Horikoff, who was one of the founders of this landscaping school. But these are disjointed stories in a way on all these aspects. And there is a text on Claire Parrin on teaching and research and urbanization. But this is yet to come for the historical analysis. For these parts of the development of research, from the 80s onwards, we've asked the testifiers to testify about this. And Stephanie, you talked about multidisciplinarity, and underlying, we had this question regarding research and the relationship with the pedagogy. Yeah, this laboratory that had a particular theme that was supposed to regroup several teachings and teachers, well, they followed the same themes, which became, at a later stage, laboratories. So this question regarding multidisciplinarity, which was discussed after 1968, and then it was institutionalized in the 70s by an institution in Grenoble called AGRA, and it allowed several of the players to facilitate all the administrative work for the signature of contracts, funding, etc. We talked about that in the book in different ways through this introduction with Sibylle, but also, as you said, Gauthier, by inviting people, testifiers, who didn't found laboratories, because we had already organized roundtables with these people that we had transcribed, but some of them will be there in the book, but not all of them. But there are other testimonies, Ferrot, with Culture Constructive. We invited Simonet because he went through the lab. He knew about the whole history, and then he withdrew. So we got different viewpoints on certain moments, on certain founding moments of agronomic research. And what is very particular in Grenoble is that there's some key people who went from one laboratory to another who initiated these themes, or several of them, and they also said that they are multidisciplinary. And according to them, they shouldn't have had recourse to multidisciplinarity. That is a sociologist, an historian, but they themselves embody this multidisciplinarity. Guy Schlegans, who came from the Environment Institute from Paris to Grenoble, he founded the Montagne Laboratory, which was a rural heritage. And then he'll be very involved in the laboratory on Earth, and he will create the design department at the school in Grenoble. So key people with whom we had long interviews, we had access to their private archives, and they really wanted to have multidisciplinarity, but in a very particular way, by embodying all these people at the same time. So I told you about La Cage, which is an association that became institutionalized in 1975. And what is very strong in Grenoble is the proximity between teaching and research. Maybe I said it, but I'd like to repeat this theme with laboratories that was in the mid-70s, and here we had several teachings. Students in the third cycle choose what teaching they're interested in, and they'll be part of these two teams. And in the last years of their teaching, they will have teachers from TPFE who are not always architects, because the TPFEs, we see it in several schools, they work on texts. These are the memoirs, and the directors of these TPFEs are once again sociologists, historians, very few architects, those who really practice architecture. So teachings, like the local ones, are embodied by certain personalities, and some emerge more strongly in the books. In Rennes, for example, it's the South American teachers in Grenoble, the Brazilian ones in Bordeaux. We have Ferrer, who was mentioned, and Pierre Lajus, who are highly present in the book. André, can you talk about these South Americans? You talked about the people from Quebec, but you also have people from South America and the Belgians. Well, the South Americans arrived later in 74, 75. And it is interesting because with the people from Quebec, teaching was really focused on developing imagination, the imaginary, sorry. And so there was this need for the student who would work lentily on himself, and through maximum creative production of small drawings, papier-mâché, small productions. And the student was supposed to invent something new, create something new. So it was this work on the student that was important, and there was this exploratory work. And with these architects who came from Latin America, I think that things slowly shifted towards different principle, which was reality. And two really marked this period. One is Pablo Artuzar. He was from Valparaiso, and then he went to the workshop of Oscar Niemeyer. He came from Algeria because he was at the Constantine University. He was operational architecture at the Constantine University. And he had this way of practicing which was such that he had legitimacy opposed to another legitimacy from the Quebecans, for example, and they were more imaginary, more poetic. And he played a very important role. Students today, former students, talk about the orders of Althusser, that is this effort on observation. One of the classics was the students were asked to make 45 drawings on a drop of water. So those are the type of order that was made to work on the development of their observation. And Althusser played an important role in the school because at one point, for 4 years, he invested l'ILOD, which was founded at the Urbino University, and he worked with Giancarlo De Carlo, and he devoted several seminars in Brittany, in Ouessant, on this topic of the environment, the physical environment and the landscape. So that was one of the first players who arrived in 1975 at the school. Then there was a second one who arrived, and he was a former collaborator of Le Corbusier. He was here for 2.5, 4 years, between 1947 and 1950, and that's Serralta. So he was a very discreet character. And Le Corbusier cried when he left his agency to go back to Montevideo. That's what was said. And Le Corbusier gave him this capacity as being a good plastician. So he went back to Montevideo, and then he came back to France after having had a brilliant career. He was vice rector of the University of Montevideo. He developed the teaching there. He had a very active agency. And in 1973, as you all know, dictature arrived, and he had to come back to France. Why? Because his wife was French. And so he came back to Saint-Étienne first. And then for political reasons, he had to leave Saint-Étienne. He arrived in Rennes, where he remained for 10 years. And there he redeveloped a theory mentioned by Daniel Le Quedic earlier on, and it was called Unitor. He worked with Le Corbusier on the modular, and he came back on this point on overall representations from the infinitely small to the infinitely big, and especially with the very interesting graphic work. Unitor is part of the permanent fund of the MoMAR today. And so by working on this, I discovered that there were some theses published on Serralta, and very few people know about that. So we got this idea, and in 2022, we organized an exhibition on the 3 parts of Serralta with the Le Corbusier Foundation. So teaching, because he taught for many years in Latin America and in France. Then another section on his architectural production in Latin America, in France, because he worked on the last story of the Cité Radieuse in Marseille. He really helped Le Corbusier a lot. He worked on Rosier and many other sites, and the plastician. He created some 100 works that will be published next year in a beautiful book, a fine arts book by the curator of Paris, and it will be published in 2022. And this character was very discreet he had a lot of weight in these trends, teaching architecture with this work of the architect producing something and the architect intervening in a world which is an infinite world. And in some writings, we see, of course, it was not the beginning, but we see the links he had with the environment and with this whole. And so, therefore, Stephanie, the Brazilians in Grenoble, what about the importance of the memoirs of that group? Well, before talking about the Brazilians, I'd like to say a few words about Jean Benoit. Jean Benoit was the manager for 30 years before 68, and we found very little about him. But we've just discovered this possibility of having access to family archives, because in the national and public archives, we don't have much on Jean Benoit. So his personality we need to improve on, because 30 years he was a chef d'atelier with very little material on his teachings. And the Brazilians in Grenoble, yes, that is an important chapter. After 68, Grenoble turned the page. Jean left, and we had new people coming into the school. Some arrived from France, but there were quite a number of people from abroad. Sergio Ferro arrived at the Grenoble UP in 72. He will remain for 30 years. Carlos Eck, with whom he worked, will arrive a year later in 73. He'll remain 15 years. Rodrigo Botero Lefebvre, in 75, he'll remain 1 year. And then Ruiz Overbrun. Anna Châtelet wrote a very nice text on the Brazilians in Grenoble. It will be there in the book. But with the arrival of the Brazilians in Grenoble, what is interesting is what they did. All the drawings on the sites, dessin chantier, which was used by Ferro in Brazil. And he reused this term with Ogoyar, who worked on the Villeneuve de Grenoble and the whole context around the school with a sociologist, Verdillon, and a lawyer, Rochon. And so this dessin chantier is a Marxist grid that Ferro and his team opposed to. And you see the power struggle in the field of architecture. And so here you have to read the site and the drawings. It's a criticism on architectural production, of course. And based on this expression, you have the idea of a review and then teachings and a research laboratory, which is today culture constructive. So the arrival of Brazil in Grenoble had a lot of weight, and in the memoirs of the students, this is something that really marked them. And then you have a whole teaching based on the idea that it is through construction that we can do architecture and not through drawing. We build in situ, and that is how the architectural project emerges. So this idea of experimenting, this context in situ, it goes through all the research laboratories in Grenoble. It's the converging point of various personalities and varied research laboratories that will meet on this point, on the local rooting and anchoring. Gauthier, we are in a hurry, so maybe we'll not take about Ferrei and Lager. I'd like to give the floor to Constance Ringon, who will talk about women in the schools of architecture in Toulouse, the students. Yes, we will talk about the students, women. So the idea was to decrypt, as in Toulouse, the women, because we mainly had men, as Marie-Jeanne Dumont said. What were their profile, their professional trajectory? And so let's briefly recall a few points that we have written in the article which we co-wrote with Gerard. And so it's going to be very slow. And even before women could even subscribe to artistic curricula in Toulouse 100 years before they could register for all disciplines apart from the artistic curricula, that's painting and sculpture. So we went back to that question and we looked at their approach, their integration at the fine arts, at the Beaux-Arts, which will be done gradually into the architecture section, and there'll be a passage in the specialty, which is decoration. So this approach will take place very slowly. And the classes will become mixed at the Beaux-Arts in Toulouse from 1973 onwards. And it's with the regional school and such institutions that we will see more women arriving, although they are far less in numbers compared to men. It was difficult for us to find the numbers. We had 18 women, and those are the number of dossiers we collected, but there are other figures that we could designate. So once we had the regional school, we had different profiles among these women in Toulouse. So they came from the region, apart from the occupation period, where there'll be a certain number of women who will come from the north of France, who will be sheltered and protected in Toulouse so that they can pursue their studies. And what we observe is the place of women in this teaching architecture. It's a mirror of society, of what happened in the French history at that time. And in the workshop, we observed that between the generations, there is support, whatever the gender. From the point of view of the previous generations, there is an invisibility of women. One example is the hazing with women who will not be designated like men were, but they will be ignored. And then there will be a change just before the creation of the UPs with the creation of the Atelier C, mentioned by Enrico, a dissident workshop that was created in 65 that will be managed by a new generation, and they will deal with women in a totally different way from what was done in the past. And one last point, which is interesting to underline, is that with the presence of women, there's a diversification of the job with women who will endorse functions that will be different from the work of the prime contractor. Women who will have additional training to deal with other themes, for example, sociology. They will open up to other disciplines and they will integrate other structures like the CAUEs or administrative functions. I'm thinking about school headmistresses that have gone through Toulouse, like Michel Tillemont, Michel Roubiac, or Mireille Aubert. Thank you. Now, to conclude, well, just say a few words about the last theme we were supposed to broach, but I'm not going to ask you any questions about that, which is the local anchoring, the local rooting. And that occupies a major place in all the books. Grenoble talks about it. So, registration of the teachers in Brittany. The Loquedic part, they talk about the construction of this Brittany architectural construction with people who have a link with the School of Architecture. And Anthony Sauvage, for the more recent period, talks about a rhizoma of architects in Brittany. Rhizoma, it's a very interesting term. And when we'll read the book, we will know more. For Marseille, a lot of teachers are gratified with an explanation. Architectures who are local people. Toulouse, there's the journey of practitioners, teachers. In 1968, you have a certain number of schools, apart from Bordeaux, that moved away. There was a break with the local practitioners, and then they went back to it gradually. And the books do take that into account. It's a bit of a strange conclusion. We are in a hurry. We're running late, but we had a workshop for 1 hour and 15 minutes. But since we start late, I think it's quite good. Anyway, thank you for your attention.